Welcome to the Museum of Aquarium and Pet History. Today we're going to talk about Art Deco bird cages. This is going to be a big video because this is a subject that's never been covered before, especially in video form. So we're going to cover as many cages as we can in the time lot that we have, and I'm going to start with telling you what is Art Deco. Art Deco really is something that started in France about 1910, but it didn't get a foothold until about 1925. And what it was an exhibition that they did, the International Exhibition of Modern and Decorative Arts. And they invited every country to basically display their modern and decorative arts, the latest in art. But they didn't invite Germany because of the war, World War I. And for some reason, the United States didn't show up. They said it was because they didn't understand the invitation, but I'm not buying that. I think maybe the invitation came late or something happened with the French and the US in that realm. But in any case, the US visited that exhibition, but they didn't exhibit there. And what came out of that was some of the cages that were exhibited actually came back into the US, were imported into the US. Up until that time, really what you had was American-made cages. You had, Hendryx, Osborn, Lindemann. You had quite a few different companies making cages in the United States. You didn't have imports. Well, now, after this Art Deco time, you had imports coming in because of this exhibition. This art style flourished from the 1920s and 1930s. It pretty much ended at the start of World War II, right around 1939. The Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building are perfect examples of Art Deco in modern architecture. The style was influenced by Cubism, Expressionism, ancient Egyptian art, Mayan art, etc. And the best quote I've ever heard about Art Deco is, "Nothing is cheap about Art Deco," and that is true. There is some serious collectors of Art Deco, whether it be furniture, whether it be glassware, anything Art Deco, and it's very expensive. So without further ado, let's talk about some of the cages. We're going to start with the Art Cage Company. So this is a cage from the Art Cage Company, and very little is known about them. In the museum library, we have catalogs from almost every cage company, but we don't have the Art Cage Company, and I don't know whether they didn't produce a catalog or they're just extremely rare. From what we can understand so far about them is that these cages were probably manufactured in Hong Kong and imported into the United States. We know that because they always had these decorative feeders. They had the owl feeders, they had the canary feeders. They always had very decorative feeders on them that were made in Hong Kong or China. And that kind of led us to believe that possibly these were something that was made over in China or Hong Kong, actually. Hong Kong did manufacturing back then, because this would have been 1930s. It's possible. We don't know yet. So in other words, our Art Cage Company is a big mystery. But this is one of their cages, and this is one of their stands. It's very, very beautiful. Okay, here we have an ocean liner, and this was actually manufactured by Shoemann Mayer and made in Germany, imported into the United States by Schoemann Mayer. That was the company that imported them. I've seen them sometimes come up for sale, and people say that they're made by the Bing toy company in Germany. I don't think so. They're in the Schoemann Mayer catalog, which made bird cages. So they had the knowledge to bend metal and to do wire work and stuff. So I would 100% sure this is a Schoemann Mayer cage. I have it basically in the catalog, so I know for sure that's who made this cage. It's a beautiful cage. It's definitely a steamship liner. It's I'm sure that because they imported it in the U.S., they did like a little American flag on the back, and they painted the glasswork with a little a shipmate on there. So it's a very, very interesting cage, and not very many of these have been found. I've only seen 2 or 3 of these. Over here we have a Hendryx cage, and this is one of the more heavy-duty Hendryx cages. You could see the feeders have milk glass cups in them, and the feeders are the rotating feeders. What's interesting about this cage is how heavy-duty it is. It's back when Hendryx was really using a lot of heavy metal, heavy wire This stand, I can't tell you for sure the stand's a Hendryx. I don't think it is, but this is a classic Art Deco stand where you have the glassware here at the base and the glassware coming up the rod on there. You have little griffin flying dragons here on the side. Very, very Art Deco. I'm sure Hendryx didn't make this stand. I'm not sure who made the stand because it's not signed, but it works well with this particular Hendryx cage. Here we have another very heavy Hendryx cage. This was made during a very short period of time, generally I think in the early 1930s. I don't think they made this cage for very long. It's an unusual cage. It's not very attractive, but it is from the sense of Art Deco. And that's the funny thing about Art Deco. I mean, it's kind of like the goldfish fishbowl, you know, back in the days when they had flat fish bowls and a fishbowl stand. It was almost as much about the shape and the design as it was about how well it works for the animal. This particular one, again, it's really about how it looks, because it's not a great cage. It's a little bit too small, and it doesn't have a lot of flight area in it or anything. So this would be a cage that if you did have a parakeet in it, you'd want to take them out a lot. But it is a beautiful cage and classic Art Deco made by Hendryx. One of my favorite cages that I've showed you before in other videos, this is a PNF cage, which stands for Paul N. Friedlaender. This is the spider cage, so it has a spider web for the bars and has a metal spider on it. It's really a great cage. It's just absolutely beautiful. They made this cage in 1927, so this was right at the peak of Art Deco, and this was imported. This particular one, PNF, he imported all his cages from Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic. This particular cage, it's possible it's an art cage company. We're not 100% sure, but it did come to us with the owl feeders inside. Hendryx made lots of cages like this. They made a hatbox cage and they made the round globe cages, and they did make them during the Art Deco period. But most of the Hendryx cages, the feeders were usually on the outside. The feeders were never on the inside of the cage. So it's unusual to find the feeders, the birdcage feeders, on the inside. And the owl feeders were pretty much for the art cage company. I have not seen them with other cages. So I'm guessing this is possibly an art cage company cage. Now, what's really interesting about this is the stand. Now, we don't know who made the stand, but if you look at it, look at the bottom of the stand. It has a bird claw on it. It has a lizard. It has looks like some kind of flower or lotuses. It's just absolutely amazing. I've only seen two stands like this. Definitely 1920s, definitely Art Deco period. Just an amazing birdcage stand. Very unusual to have one with a bird claw as the base. Now here we have a parrot cage. This is a Hendryx parrot cage. And this is where you get into like crossover between like Victorian era and Art Deco. This cage was made from like 1900 to 1920 by Hendryx. It's got, you know, the heavy-duty seat guard. It's got very heavy-duty tubing. It's got the bent wire here. It's got an elaborate cast stand at the very bottom. These feeders are not original. These are reproduction feeders, and they're not normal. The feeders would have been brass that went with this cage. Hendryx did this. This was like the end of this cage, about 1920, and then they went to a much simpler design of cage. Probably because the cost of manufacturing this was just too high, and tastes were changing. You know, I can't tell you what an Art Deco parrot cage looked like, but this is as close as we can get, because this was early 1920s before they discontinued it during the Art Deco period. So here we have a German imported cage from Schoemann Mayer, made in 1928. It looks like it's possibly brass or copper plated, maybe brass. It's a pretty warm color. It's an interesting cage. Very sharp edges. You wouldn't want to have this around kids. Very sharp edges on the stand as well. It has the original stand. It's very rare to find them with the original stand. But this was imported by Schoemann Mayer. And this was originally made in Germany, and again in 1928. And that's a classic Art Deco. This is another Hendryx cage. And this is it kind of fits in with the other heavy one that I showed you earlier. I believe this was in a series that they called the Oriental series. I can't remember what they called this particular cage, but it has milk glass feeders, round feeders on the inside. Very heavy manufacture. It's a beautiful cage, and it's classic Art Deco. This cage was made by Hendryx in 1920. It's a really unusual cage. I've never seen it in a catalog. And it looks like it was either a prototype, like they were considering making this cage, or it was one of the employees on his lunch hour taking parts from other cages and making this owl-looking cage. I call it the owl cage because it has two eyes and it has this glass in the middle here. It has the arts and crafts looking base and the arts and crafts looking top. If you took this top and you put it on this cage, you would have a very normal looking Hendryx cage, but you have this huge eye thing going on here. It's an interesting cage, and a little note came with it. It said this was Aunt Dora's bird cage from 1920. So it was in the same family when I got it. It was the person's aunt. And again, at least we have the date. We can date it to 1920, but we've never seen this in a catalog. And again, it was either a prototype that Hendryx was working on, or it was one of their employees making something crazy for themselves. This is also a Hendryx cage, a heavy Hendryx cage, and this again is a transitionary period. Originally, this was made in 1900s by Lindemann, and in the 1920s, when Hendryx bought out Lindemann, they produced this cage under their own name. There's no Lindemann on the door, or Hendryx on the door, but there's Hendryx on the bottom plate, and it's in the Hendryx catalog. It's also in the Lindemann catalog. So it's kind of funny when you get these cages and it's like, well, wait a minute, is it a Hendryx or it's a Lindemann? And you have to have both the catalogs to cross-reference it and know that Hendryx bought out Lindemann and they bought out Osborn. And the cages that were good sellers, they brought into their catalog. The ones that weren't, they discontinued. So this is a kind of the beginning of the Art Deco period. It's a really beautiful cage with the flowers on the corners and all the different things on the bottom there going on. In the tray that is very heavy duty. This tray, it's hard to come out, but you can see the metal on the end of the tray. And the little rotating feeders where you just put in the, they rotate like that. You could put in the cup, food cup, and then close them back up. It's actually a great way to do the feeders. I wish they'd still do them this way. This is an imported cage from Germany. This is probably a Kappf, K-A-P-F-F cages out of New York. They imported from Germany. We always can tell too, they have the feeders that are usually marked. And that's really not to tell, you can't tell where the cages are made from by the feeders actually. Because some people will say, oh, the cage is made in wherever. Well, just because it says on the feeders doesn't mean that the cage is from that area. So anyways, this is a German-made cage from the company Kappf. This is another cage also, very Art Deco from same manufacturer from Kappf. It's a nice cage. It's got the point at the top. It looks like it's hand hammered, which is a little bit arts and craftsy. The arts and crafts movement started really about 1910, but this cage is definitely falls into the 1920s era and falls into Art Deco. This is a Schoemann Mayer cage. This is made in 1933. I call it the painted marble cage because it has these flat green marbles. It's got rolled steel. It's got a painted design both on the glass, the seat guard glass, and also on the metal. Very, very Art Deco. They even painted the bird feeders a gold color. Neat cage, very neat cage when they roll the metal like that and they do painted work on it. Obviously stencil work, but very labor intensive. Very nice cage. Okay, so this is a great cage. This is a Paul Friedlaender cubist design. And the catalog says it was made to meet the demand for modernistic vogue, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I love this design of this cage. It is very cubist, very Picasso-y, with the little edges and stuff that go at an angular wet method. And it's got these glass or these painted design on the bottom. The glass is broken. We'll have to repair that, but it's also indentated glass here. It's a very nice cage. Very, very beautiful and very classic Art Deco. This is another Paul Friedlaender cage made in 1930. This particular cage would have had a celluloid seat guard and it's number 398E is what it says in the catalog. So they didn't call it a spider cage, but this is their other version of a spider cage. I think it came out maybe a little earlier than the other one, I'm not sure. But here you've got the metal spider, then you've got the design which kind of mimics a spider web. The other one was more intricate than this one was, but it's a cool cage. Some people call it a bee cage because it has these little bees down at the corner that were painted. But a very interesting and unusual cage that I seldom ever, this actually is the only one I've ever seen. So here's a cage you don't see very often. This is a Genykage, and Genykage was from England. And this is probably the oldest one we have in the museum, because this one goes back to the 30s when they did the little G finial on top of their cages, which is definitely very old. They've got this very large porcelain bird feeders that they painted blue to match the blue top. They have a little plastic seed guard down here that's painted, and then they have their logo, Genykage, and cage with a K on the door. It's a very attractive cage and very uncommon. This is the only one that I've seen of this particular cage. So here we have another Kappf cage, K-A-P-F-F, Kappf, German imported cage. It looks like it's hand hammered, which is quite nice. It's got this large span glass in the front of it, and then you've got your inserted birdcage feeders on the sides here. It's a well-made cage. The glass has definitely got the inlay to it, and what a piece of glass it is. I mean, it's definitely framed in brass with the little hand-hammered edges on the side. It's amazing that the glass actually survived, because a lot of times the glass on cages like this breaks, and that's very difficult to get that replaced or even have it look like the original. So that's a Kappf cage, and then definitely imported and German. This is an unusual cage. I'm guessing that this is a Kappf cage as well, imported from Germany, but I'm not positive. And sometimes I've seen similar cages like these. They call them the wheel cages, just because they have that round wheel look to them. The doors are on the side here, which is kind of cool, the way the door goes at an angle. And then your bird feeders go in here. This lifts up and you put your bird feeder in there. It's got quite an angle on the tray on the bottom. None of these have been restored. This one has had no restoration to it, so the tray's stuck. But it's quite an interesting cage. I don't really get what this is for. You think this would like move, but it doesn't. It doesn't move at all. This is solid. And the way they've done the wires going out like that, that had to have been very labor intensive. So I'm thinking that they didn't make these cages for very long. Unusual cage, very unusual and very Art Deco. So here we have another Hendryx bird cage. This is called the Mission Cage, and it is signed on the door Hendryx. Has a slide-in feeders with a little upside-down heart-shaped door that goes on there. Now, even though this was made during the Art Deco period, it's really arts and crafts, and they kind of overlapped. And arts and crafts was sort of a rebellion against the Victorian era design. They wanted everything to be much more geometric, handmade, that kind of thing, very straight lines. So that's kind of where this falls into. Even though it's made during the Deco era, it really falls under arts and crafts. And it was made by Hendryx. And again, that was called the Mission Cage, which came in 3 different versions, by the way. They had different roof versions, and they had one that was stamp metal. This is probably one of the most classic Art Deco bird cages that we have in the museum. This is a Shoemann Mayer. This was made in 1933. It's got what they call the chromatic black trim. This is cage number 88, and it's sold for $9.50 in 1933, so that was a lot of money. This was, you know, a $50+ cage back then, if not more. So you can imagine this is something that was only for the rich and famous at the time. It's really well constructed. I mean, you have flat bars and square bars in the front, and then you have regular chromed bars on the side. Even the perches look like they're almost made out of redwood. It's really interesting. It's a red wood that's trimmed differently than normal bird perches are. And then if you look at the stand, you look how angular it is, even right down to the base. This is classic Art Deco. This is really what Art Deco is all about. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Chrysler building in its design and its shape. So this would have been something that Schoemann Mayer probably displayed in France, being that the cages were imported. Well, that is if they weren't German made, I'm sorry. So it would have been the companies that were Czechoslovakia that would have displayed at the French exhibit. Okay, this is another Hendryx cage, and this one is called the Nippon. It was made in 1934, and it's definitely in the Oriental style. It has the original stand, so you could see the green coming down on the stand and then the green base on it. Very, very Art Deco. It even has the original jadeite feeders. These are the feeders that would have come with it, made out of jadeite. It's a beautiful cage, and it's classic in its design. It's got the Oriental roof style with a little different top to it, and the half crescent moon shaped stand. This is a Paul Friedlaender cage from Czechoslovakia. You could see the cutout in the front. It's got some different feeders that somebody threw in there. Those aren't original feeders, but it's really interesting. I mean, you see the way that the wires go in the front. They go like it is sort of a sunburst, sun rays, and then you've got the PDF on the door. It wasn't just his name. He also used PDF as PNF, sorry. Perfect, novel, and fine was his other tagline that he made for his insignia. And then if you look at the stand at the base, which is gorgeous, it's got the original stand with this cage, and you can see how Art Deco it is just by looking at the base with the blue color and everything. It's just beautiful. So this is a Crown cage, and it's not signed, but it's in the Crown catalog. We have the catalog that pictures this cage. I find a lot of mid-century modern crowns, from the 1950s, that sort of thing. But I don't find 1937, and that's when this cage was made, was 1937. It has the original stand with the crescent moon. It has this round, cage in the front with these sort of wings that come on the side. Crown prides itself on saying that they triple plate their cages, and if you look at how bright the plating is, it looks like it's been triple plated. It does look really beautiful. This was an amazing find. I walk into a thrift store and they had it for like $75, and I just couldn't buy it fast enough because I knew it was important Art Deco. I didn't know who made it because it wasn't signed, but then I went through the catalogs, and sure enough, it's in the Crown catalog. And I don't find any Crown cages that date back that far. Again, most of them are from the 1950s, but this one's 1937. So that's a Crown bird cage. And you can see it's got the little milk glass bird bath in the bottom that we probably put in there. So this is another Hendryx cage. I don't believe the stand went with this cage, at least I'm not positive. But this was made in 1931. It's called the Gothic. And you can see it has the original feeders. These are celluloid feeders, which is a type of very thin plastic, very brittle. It's blue is the original paint color for this cage. And that was when they went through this phase of basically giving cages names. There was one time that Hendryx gave cages numbers, and that was it. This particular time, they gave them names, and they called this one the Gothic. And it was made in 1931. I'll take a minute to give you a little bit of history on Hendryx, on what they bought out and whatnot. Hendryx started in 1869 selling fishing reels. Andrew Hendryx who's a founder, died in 1910 at the age of 76. Nathan took over, his son, in 1907 at the age of 27, and ran the company for, probably 40 years. In 1918, they had 250 employees, a 100,000 square foot building, and they said that by 1938, they sold 20 million cages. The one thing that you need to know about Hendryx, it's important, is that they bought out Osborn, Lindemann, Leon, and possibly Maxwell. But I know for sure they bought out the 3 cage companies. We don't know that they bought out Maxwell for sure, but we think they did. And their competitors during the Deco period was Schoemann Mayer, bringing in German cages. Friedlaender, P&F cages, those are from Czechoslovakia. Silvertone, which made Caspin's bird food, that's from England. Kappf cages, that's from Germany. The Genykage was made by George Baker out of England, and the Art Cage Company, which we just don't know. So that's just a little brief history on Hendryx. This is the Hendryx bullet cage. That's what I call it. It looks like a kind of a bullet. This was made briefly, I believe, late 20s, early 1930s. This was the original stand that came with this cage. Normally they were bright, shiny brass, but this one has faded over the years. And when we get a chance, we'll clean these up more and put the original feeders back with them. We just, again, it's just not enough hours in the day to get all this done, but we do want to restore all these as much as we can without taking away original patina. Like on this one here, you know, you've got a patina, sure, but it would look nicer if it had a little bit of polish on it and was brass and had the original feeders. This is a great cage because it has a mica top. Mica is sort of a form of interesting plastic that they made. They used it a lot in lamps. And this particular cage was made by Paul Friedlaender. And so this was imported from Czechoslovakia. Again, boy, they sure did an amazing job. I mean, to put the mica in top so you get some light, and you have these large spaces for feeders here. You've got sort of this little interesting little pattern going here, pattern going on the top. Gorgeous stand. I mean, really interesting Art Deco stand that went with this cage. Okay, now we have another Shoemann Mayer cage, and this has the original stand. Again, the stands are really rare to find with them. The stand looks like it's a hand-hammered stand, and you've got what looks like hand-hammered right here on the base of the cage. Beautiful cage with, again, the sunburst coming on the top. You've got the seat guard, which is missing the glass, but we will get that fixed. Feeders. A lot of times these feeders are unmarked, but it's got the little, it's numbered. It says 1943, that's interesting. This is an Art Cage Company, and it has the owl feeders on it, has the original stand, and it has this thing that says the Ye Wayside Inn. And I remember picking up one of these in Kansas at an antique shop years and years ago. And they told me this story of how there used to be this place called the Ye Wayside Inn, and they had a few of these cages in there, and these cages were from that particular inn. It was a great story. Too bad it's not true. I believe that Art Cage Company made these cages private label for Sears and Roebuck. If you look in the old Sears and Roebuck catalog, you will see this cage, and it says Ye Wayside Inn. So they basically just wanted to kind of make it a sort of an old English inn cage. And that's why they decided to have some fun and put that little name on the one of the plates that go on the outside of the cage. And then they private labeled it for just for sale to Sears. So Sears was the only one that sold the Ye Wayside Inn cage, but they must have had quite a few. And I've seen 3 or 4 of these now. So I'm not buying the story that there was a Ye Wayside Inn. I think that Art Cage Company just had fun, made this special for Sears and Roebuck to sell in their catalog. And that is the story behind that cage. Now we have another Hendryx cage. This was sold in the 1920s. It has one of the rare older Hendryx feeders in these cages. This is the feeder that has an angle to it. These are very unusual Hendryx feeders that you don't find very often, and that would have gone with these cages. But Hendryx did a lot of these balloon cages, you know, the ones that were round like this. This one, it's in pretty poor shape. It's been rewired on the door. Again, it's very patinaed. You know, it would have been bright brass colored when it was new. And you could have either hung it on a stand or you could have set it on a table. It has this base here to set it on a table. I don't think this is the original stand. This is a very heavy duty stand. This probably went for a different type of cage. This cage I call the teardrop cage. It's not a common cage, and I don't think Hendryx probably made more than 100 of these cages. That's my guesstimate. Again, A lot of times companies will make an unusual cage to show what their manufacturing capabilities are, or they'll make it to give you the wow factor when you come to a trade show booth, showing people saying, hey, this is what we can do. We can make these really amazing cages, classic Art Deco. And you look at the stand, I mean, it's got this little finial, glass finial at the top. You know, it's got these little rotisserie little things here, glass things here on the sides. It's got a very heavy duty, sort of a lion-footed stand at the bottom. The cage is not very functional. I mean, I don't think a bird would have a great time in a cage like this, but from an Art Deco standpoint of view, it's a beautiful cage. I mean, it really is. It's gorgeous. I mean, something like this you'd probably have for maybe a canary, and you'd take it out quite a bit and give them a little playtime, that kind of thing. So the feeders actually go inside the cage, which is interesting. So they don't hang outside. There's actually a little thing in there where you attach the feeders to the inside of the cage. It is a really unusual cage. It's classic Art Deco, and it was made probably about 1928 to 1932 in that realm. And I don't think they made many at all of these because I don't see them very often. All right, so this one is a Kappf cage out of New York, imported from Germany. And I love this cage. It's very Asian looking, definitely brass. It's got this stamped metal on it. It's got this little roof on it. It's got the sun coming in from the side here, which I thought was wonderful. And this is the only example I've ever seen of this cage. So it's not common at all. Extremely Art Deco. And again, this is from Kappf out of New York. And they imported these cages from Germany. This is also a German cage, but I'm not positive of the manufacturer. I just want to show you this cage because this would really be classified as Art Nouveau. I mean, see the squiggly lines in the cage design? I mean, incredibly labor intensive to make a cage like this, and it's tubular on the outside, which I thought was interesting. This is all indentated in the glass. A very nice glass design with a very large glass panel in the front and back. Definitely Art Nouveau. I'm sure made in the 20s during the Deco period, but they made it in the Nouveau style, which is interesting. And if I had to guess, I would say German made, but I'm not positive. I've never seen this in a catalog. It's just an unusual cage I thought was something that you folks need to see. So this cage was made by Hendryx, and it's made out of Friedlaender. Friedlaender was a type of plastic material, much like Bakelite. It was something that Hendryx was very proud of, but they didn't get the memo that birds like to chew on plastic. Also, plastic doesn't hold up very well. This cage, when I got it, was literally just deteriorating. I mean, cracking and falling apart. We had to re-glue it. We had to use a resin compound on the plastic on the outside. I mean, literally to save this stand, we had to go through and redo the whole thing. It's got celluloid feeders, so the whole thing is plastic, except for the inside of the stand is metal. But it was a disaster. This was one of those things, somebody had an idea at Hendryx and it wasn't a good idea. And the cage just, I think they sold them for about 3 years, but not many of them survived. Just not great material. So this is a fun cage. This one came out of Italy. And all we really know about it was made by an architect. And it was made in the 20s or 30s in that time period. It's definitely more arts and crafts than it is Art Deco. And it was all handmade. And I just think it's a super fun cage. I mean, an architect probably had a bird that he loved a lot, and he decided to make a little 2-story a house for him. And he made this all by hand. When it came in, it had some damage. We had to restore it. It's quite a beautiful bird cage. It's even got a little balcony and a TV antenna, you know, because you know those parakeets, they like to watch their shows. So that's the arts and crafts bird cage made during the Deco period by an architect out of Italy. 3 cages I want to show you from P&F, which is Paul Friedlaender. And these are imported from Czechoslovakia, sold in the US by that company. And they're very Art Deco. You could see it's like stamped flat metal on the outside with designs on them. You've got a yellow cage here with some flowers, and you've got this bright orange cage here. And then you've got a green cage here that's just gorgeous. And you could see these are the original feeders that came with it. These little feeders with a roof on them. So when you find these types of feeders, they went with this Czechoslovakia Art Deco cage. And the interesting thing too is they use this sort of a plastic celluloid, they said, material that they used as their seed guard. So they didn't use glass. And of course, you could see on this one here where it broke, it came out. So we've got 4 of these style of cages. And I have one that's very similar, but this is a Schoemann Mayer. So this one is definitely German, where the other ones are Czechoslovakia. But it's very similar. They use glass, and they actually did a stencil paint on the glass, and they painted, of course, the outside of the cage. They have more of the peaked roof instead of the flat Dutch type roof. So interesting and beautiful cage. This is a Lindemann cage. And this is probably the tail end of Lindemann before they got bought out by Hendryx. And you could see where they've used a lot of rolled top metal. You know, the roof is stamped and they've rolled a metal top and they've rolled it here. So this would have been, you know, Lindemann's out of the Victorian style and they're into the Art Deco style right before they closed up and sold their assets to Hendryx. But that's probably the only Art Deco version of a Lindemann cage that we have in the museum. But it's a really nice cage, very cool. And I'll have to find this in the catalog and put the correct feeders on it. This was a classic fish tank stand that we actually made from a picture from an old catalog. And it's got one of the original tanks in it. And then we hung this cage on it. This is an Art Cage company cage. It's got the little Chinese people, and they also made one with owls. And those are the releases to release the bottom tray so you can actually change the parakeet or canary paper. You just push down and it releases the bottom tray, which is very ingenious. And again, Art Cage Company made this. The roof is very interesting because it has sort of a brick pattern to the roof, and which carries over into the cage in this base here. It's a great cage, and it has the original paint, which is something you don't find very often. You know, I'm fascinated by Art Cage Company, and it's too bad we just can't find more information about them. So this is a Shoemann Mayer, imported out of Germany. Beautiful brass cage, lots of additional little columns here, lots of seat guards going around it with this big heavy window in the middle. The perches are really small inside. It was actually really interesting that they made such small bird perches. So this would have been for a very small legged bird, you know, maybe finches, I'm not sure. Definitely 1920s, 1930s. It's got the rope stand, beautiful stand with a woman at the bottom of it. Very classic Art Deco stand. Again, imported by Schoemann Mayer and from Germany. All right, well, thank you for watching the Art Deco birdcage video. We tried to give you as many cages as we could in the allotted time. Be sure to tune in later in the year because we'll have a mid-century modern birdcage video. I also want to do another birdcage video that basically talks about ones that were made privately, like people that actually had a garage operation and make high-end cages, just small numbers of them, because we have a collection of those at the museum as well. So be sure to watch also in June. This is coming out in June. Watch the video that we're doing on the 1-year anniversary of the museum. We're going to talk about our library. We're going to talk about our restoration studio. We're going to talk about the new building that we have, or we're going to have. So that's going to be important. So if you can watch that as well, that's great. And so I thank you. Thank you all for everything you've done, for giving me one great, wonderful year of having fun talking about these antiques. All right. So till next time, see you later.